Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Fractured Vows. Chapter 86. Lena. I couldn't believe how much I wanted Eli. It didn't help that Bex was horny, making it hard for me to think straight. She kept sending me dirty images of what we should do to Eli, which was sending me into a dirty little slut. Made him, she moaned. I want to hear Blaze. I ignored her. I know he wants more. Eli moans into my mouth and pulls back, gasping and trying to breathe. He murmured as he looked at me. I know you wanted to take it slow, Lena, but I can't hold on much longer. You sure you want to have me right now? I frowned at him and placed my arms on either side of his head, staring down at him as I left my bottom half up slightly, but his hands on my hips tightened as he tried to hold me in place. Elias, I said, trying not to show any amusement in what I was doing to him. I know I mentioned slow to you, but the mate bond is affecting me more than it should, and besides, I have one really horny wolf on my hands who wants me to claim you. Eli stares at me with wide eyes as a smirk slowly itches the corners of his mouth. Elias, hey, he said, and without realizing it, Eli moved quickly and used his speed, placing me on my back, lying down on the couch as he pinned me with my arms up above my head and my legs wrapped around his waist. I can't help the moan that escapes. Bex was panting in my head and loud. Eli stares at me with a grin. Now, he says as he hovers over my lips. Stop calling me Elias. I can accept you calling me that when you are angry with me, but when I am about to make you come, I want to hear Eli coming out of that mouth. I stared at him and was about to say something, but Eli kissed me and slid his tongue back into my mouth. His hands started to wander, lifting my top over my head in one swoop as he pulled back slightly to get it off as he let go of my arms to remove it. I moved my arms to get his shirt off, but I got too eager as I ripped at his shirt and exposed his A*S. I couldn't help but admire his body. He looked good. Are you done checking me out? He says, which makes me look at him. The same stupid smirk was plastered on his face. I groan, but Eli kisses my lips. I moan into his mouth. I was acting like a needy girl in heat. I needed his touch, I needed everything from him. I pulled back, trying to catch my breath. More, I begged. I want more. Eli moved slightly. This was the first time that he was going to see me NK, and I was starting to feel slightly cautious about my body and move my arms to cover my stomach. I know the stain that Alpha Trevor left was on the right side, it was still there and looked hideous. I didn't want him to see it, not yet, at least. I know what it has looked like over the last few days, but I have ignored it as I knew it would make me more body conscious. Eli growled. Don't cover up, he said as he moved my arms away. I want to see what is mine. You have nothing to hide from me. You are gorgeous, and I love seeing you like this. I must admit, I have been thinking about seeing you for a while. I didn't say anything as Eli moved away slightly and took a better look at me. His eyes roamed over my body, but his eyes never went to the scar. I was grateful for that, but watching him look at me with admiration made me wonder if Blaze sensed something and told him. I tried not to let anything faze me as I continued to watch Eli. His eyes went all over me, his eyes met mine, but they kept changing from his to Blaze, then back to his again, which confirmed my suspicions about the scar. Eli, I whispered, but he shook his head. I want a taste, he said. More for me, he said as he moved onto the bed. Oh, goddess, I was in trouble, I thought as Eli moved me into position as he hovered over me. He leaned further down and went close to my ear as he growled. Mine. Chapter 87. Lena. I lay tangled in the sheets as the light streamed into the room, waking me up. I feel sore in all places. An image of last night's events flooded my mind and had my core throb. Eli and I went at it like rabbits all night long. I never knew half of the positions he had me in, but I was aching in places this morning. I moved slightly, realizing I was lying on my stomach. I looked over the side and saw Eli's face. He was still asleep, but his arm was draped over my waist as I lay there. I placed my head down and stared at him. I was falling for him, and hard too. The mate bond affected me in every possible stride, and I had no clue how to slow it down, even though I didn't want it to. During our night of antics, Bex kept badging me to mark with Eli, but I didn't know how to bring it up. I know we need to, and I would like to, but part of me was having a problem with it, and I couldn't place my finger on why. I couldn't help but admire Eli. The sheet barely covered his torso, but it sat around his hips. I could see his A*S on show, but I moved back to his face. He didn't snore, but his face was soft when he slept. I looked toward Bex, who was snoring softly in my head. I was the only one awake. I looked back at Eli, whose eyes were wide, but it wasn't Eli. It was Blaze. My eyes widened. "Blaze," I whispered. He gave a slight nod and leaned toward me. He kissed my lips but pulled back. "Little mate," he murmured as he moved back to where Eli was before. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but a deep frown appeared. "Something is up," he whispered. "Talk to me." I stared at him. I sighed. "I don't know," I said as I moved to face him. I placed my hand on his hip as he pushed his hand on mine, drawing circles close to my scar, which made me tense. He stopped and looked at me, trying to figure out what was happening. I couldn't help but close my eyes. Eli never went near the stain once last night, and I was grateful for it. "Open your eyes, little mate," Blaze murmured. I opened my eyes and looked back at his. His hand stayed close to the scar, but he didn't move. "That is a wound to be proud of," he said. "It is a reminder of how strong you are as a Luna." I frowned. "It's not," I said. He took a chunk out of my side, but Blaze cut me off as he placed his finger on my lips. "He might have, but you rescued us," he said. I stared at him, confused. Blaze stares back and chuckles slightly. "If you didn't jump in when you did, both Eli and I would have been killed by that lunatic," he said. I could feel anger swipe in, but he controlled himself, trying not to get angry. I placed my hand on his, making him look at me, which made me smile. "Little mate," he said, "I know we haven't told you thank you for saving us, so let me tell you, thank you." I smiled. Blaze moved his hand and placed it on my scar. I flinched, but after a few seconds, I calmed down. Blaze stared at me and sighed. "That's not what's wrong," he said. "Tell me." I stared at him and could feel movement in my head. "Bex wants me to mark you," I said. Blaze grinned, but it slowly went when he stared at me as I tried to figure out how to tell him how I felt. Blaze drew circles on my hip and over my scar, sending tingles right through me. "I want to," I said but sighed. "I don't know, part of me is happy with how things are going, and I don't want to change it." Blaze stared at me, but his face softened. "You think human will be a dumbass again?" he asked, which made me snort out a laugh. Blaze grinned. "I won't let him," he said, as his grin widened. "I would kick his ass, but I know you would too. Bex and I want both of you to mark as we want to talk and get to know one another." We want to be with each other more than ever, and we know you are trying to believe human, but you need to take the risk when it comes to him. He loves you, I can feel it. My eyes widen, and Blaze disappears as Eli stares back at me. Wolf, he muttered. I moved toward him and placed my hand on his cheek. Eli stared at me. He shouldn't have, he said, but I cut him off and kissed him. I pulled back and smiled. You were listening in on everything, weren't you? I asked. Eli looked at me and held me tight. I was, he said. I didn't realize that you were self-conscious about the scar. You should have told me. I would have made more of an effort with it. I stared at him, confused. Eli moved us so I was lying on my back, and he was up on his arms. He looked down at me as his hand schemed over my stomach to my side. He leaned toward me and kissed my lips as his hand drew circles over my scar. I gulped as tingles shot through me, and my core tightened again. Eli's mouth moved from my lips and over places of my body. He twisted his body till he parted my legs and moved in between them. I knew he was happy, I could feel it through the mark the first gave him. Sleep, he murmured as I looked up at him. His eyes were finally closing, and I knew he needed to sleep. I was happy, and so was Bex, prancing around in my head. I knew I did the right thing in marking him, but I also knew it wouldn't be long before Eli marked me. I wanted him as much as he wanted me. Chapter 88. Eli. I was in the land of pure bliss and didn't want to wake up. Lena had marked me, and I was over the moon. I knew marking was an issue for her, I could tell. Now, she will get to feel everything I feel for her. I felt Blaze push me back, which woke me from my sleep. I listened in on what she was saying. When Blaze thanked her, it made me realize that I was a dumbass for not thanking her for saving us, which technically she did. If she didn't keep Alpha Trevor busy, I wouldn't have gotten those rogues off me. I felt happy. I moved slightly, but my eyes shot open as I stared to the side of me. Lena wasn't in bed with me, I was on my own. Where was she? Something hits my nose, making my stomach growl loudly at the smell. Bacon. Sausage. Food, I thought. Blaze chuckled in my head as I stared back at him. Maid is cooking food for us, he said. She wanted us to sleep after the marking. I stared at him, confused. Bex told me, he said with a grin. I was happy to hear that he could listen and talk to Bex. I like hearing his voice. A voice came crushing into my head as I looked at Blaze, slightly concerned that I was hearing things, but it only made him laugh. Bex, he murmured. Hi, Eli, she whispered. Once Lena lets you mark her, Blaze will be able to communicate with her too. I smiled. I'm honored to meet you, I said. How is she? Bex sighed, but in a good way. Go downstairs and see, she said. Little thing to know about our Lena. She dances when she is happy, and at this moment, she is swaying those hips like there is no tomorrow. I moved out of bed in a shot, which made both Bex and Blaze laugh in my head. I walked quickly downstairs and noticed the clothes from last night folded up on the couch. I quickly grabbed my boxers and pulled them up. I looked toward the kitchen and walked through, but I stopped as I saw that Bex was right. Right in front of me was Lena swaying her hips as she cooked. The music was loud. I couldn't help but feel slightly aroused at the sight. She knew how to move her hips. I wasted no time, I knew she would feel everything I felt. I moved toward her and wrapped my arms around her waist, which made her stop. I leaned into her, grazing her neck with my lips as I placed a kiss in a place and moved closer to her ear. I like how you move, I whispered as I ground my body toward hers and started to sway her hips with mine. Lena leans back into my chest. I sway with her as I place a kiss which makes her moan slightly. Lena moves slightly and turns around to look at me. Eli, she says as she wraps her arms around my neck while holding the spatula. As much as this is turning me on, she says. I'm cooking and starving. I know you are too, so how about we eat, and we can carry on with what you started. I smiled. I placed a kiss on her lips and pulled back. With pleasure, I said. Do you want me to help? Lena looked at me but shook her head. Everything's nearly done, she said. You can take a seat if you want. I nodded but kissed her again before letting her go and moving away to sit at the table. I walked over to the table and sat down, watching Lena as she went back to cooking. I soon realized that she was wearing some shorts and an oversized top. She must have been up early, I thought. I fell asleep when you passed out, she said, pulling me from my thoughts. I woke up an hour ago. I was hungry and knew you would be too, so I thought I would make us some food. I looked at her, amused, as she looked over her shoulder at me. A smirk itched the corners of her mouth. Bex told me what you were thinking, she said. I smiled, that was going to take some getting used to. Bex giggled in my head. I have to admit, I loved hearing her too. After a few seconds, Lena was dishing out everything and putting everything in front of us. I was surprised to see so much food in front of us. Lena sat down opposite me, and we both began to eat. We stayed in silence to eat. Realizing that we didn't have much to eat after what happened on the couch, all I could think about was having Lena all evening, and that's what I did. I FK'd her in every position I could. I admit I couldn't get enough of her moaning my name. I looked up at Lena as I took the last bite of my food. I was about to say something when a knock came through the house. Someone was here. I stared at Lena as she stood up. I'll get it, she said. I watched as Lena walked away from the table. I wanted to kill whoever was on the other side of the door, but as I heard some voices and the front door closing, I looked to the side and noticed we weren't alone anymore. There behind Lena stood Keith and Tim. I smiled. Keith and Tim looked at me, but I could feel Keith's eyes on me and widen as he looked at my mark. He smiled. Good morning, Tim said as he walked in. I leaned back in my chair as I watched both men walk in and stand to the side as Lena returned to her seat. We only wanted to come and check to see if you were okay and that the food was okay, Tim said. I nodded, but I noticed the slight nudge that Keith gave Tim, which made Tim look at me, but his eyes landed on my mark, and he smiled. You marked Eli, he said out loud. Lena, that's fantastic. Lena looked at him, but she moved back to my eyes. No words left her mouth, but I could see Tim and Keith glance at her neck and look at me. Keith's eyebrows moved up as he realized I didn't mark her. I shook my head. Keith gave me a knowing look and smiled. He must have sensed what I suggested to Lena and was happy with her decision. Tim was over the moon, but I didn't think he minded that she didn't mark me. You have to tell your father, he said as I looked back at him. We have to organize Lena's Luna ceremony now. I heard something land on the table hard, which made me look at Lena. Lena stared at me with wide eyes. Luna ceremony, she muttered. What do I have to do for that? She asked. I smiled. It will be a ceremony where you will pledge to be my Luna in front of the pack, I said. We can do it in a few weeks or when you are ready. I could feel Blaze move in my head and look at Lena. Bex says something is up, he murmurs, taking me completely off guard. What do you mean? I asked. Blaze didn't say anything, but I stared at Lena, who looked like she wanted to throw up. "Does the Luna ceremony have any traditions?" she asked, which sounded hard coming from her lips. "We have some," I said, looking at her, confused. "Like what?" she asked. I looked at Tim and Keith, who were now staring at us. Keith shrugged, but Tim's face was stern. "Lena," he said. "The Luna ceremony is one of the traditional ceremonies. It will establish you as a pack member and who you are. That's not to mention you are Eli's mate." I stared at her as her eyes went from mine to his. "I'm just asking what traditions there are," she said, and looked back at me. I cleared my throat and told her what to expect. "Well, we both have to dress up, and every Alpha and Luna is invited to attend," I said. "It is like a wedding, but it is focused on you and I becoming joined as one as mates." Lena stares at me but doesn't say anything. I felt a pang of hurt run through me. Does she want a Luna ceremony? I thought. The way she was acting was making my mind run wild with worry. Keith cleared his throat, making me look at him. His eyes were concerned as he looked between Lena and me. "You can wait till you are ready, Lena," Keith said. "There is no rush." "No, she can't," says Tim, which makes me glare at him. His face was annoyed. "Lena has committed to being Eli's mate by marking him," he said. "She has to follow the rules of the pack law, whether he has marked her or not. She needs to be his Luan, and more importantly, she needs to be the pack's Luna." I looked toward her, but her face was unreadable. I knew Tim was right, but something was clearly up with her. I looked at Blaze. "Blaze," I muttered to him. "What is she thinking? What has Bex said?" Blaze stares but doesn't say anything, which makes me look back at him. He looked hurt. "Bex is pissed," he whispered. "I don't know why she won't talk to me," he said. I look back at Lena. Lena stares at me but pushes back on her chair and stands. She looks at me, but after a few moments, she walks away and leaves the kitchen. I look at Tim and Keith, who are staring at the door. I got up from my chair, not saying a word to them. I walked out and went upstairs to Lena's room. The door was closed. I placed my hand on the door handle, only for the door to open and there stood Lena, anger written on her. "I think you should go and train," she said, slamming the door in my face. What the freaking hell was all that about? I felt hurt by her actions but also angry too. I needed to know what she was thinking. I needed answers. I knocked on her door, but she never opened up. "Lena," I shouted through the door. "Open this door." There was still no sound or movement. I kept knocking, but with every knock, I got louder and harder as my fist hit the door. Blaze was up front and was pissed. I needed to get out of the house. I knocked once more, but no answer. I huffed out. How can one mate change her mood so much in one sitting? I thought. I needed to leave, and now. I didn't want to be around her if she was going to act this childish. I turned and walked back downstairs, only to be met by Tim and Keith. I looked at them and frowned. "You didn't have to tell her like that about the Luna ceremony," I said to Tim, who bowed his head. "I only got her to mark me so she could feel everything I felt towards her, nothing more. The Luna ceremony can wait, and now I might not have a Luna." Tim looked up at me and was about to speak, but Keith beat him. "Tim," he said as his eyes went to his brother. "You know what Lena is like and what you said, and how you said it didn't help the situation. I also told you we didn't need to come here as they wanted to be together." I looked at Tim and frowned. "Why did you come here anyway?" I asked. Tim looked at me and sighed. Your father wanted to know what was going on, he said. I couldn't get hold of Lena, nor can your father with you. I thought we could. I don't know, I wasn't thinking, and when I saw your mark, I got excited. I sighed. I'm going for a run, I muttered. I need to clear my head, and Blaze is angry too. It seems Bex is not talking to him either. I looked at both men and sighed. I turned around and walked toward the front door. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I couldn't stay. My emotions were everywhere, and most pain and anger filled me. I hated her acting like this, it made me second-guess everything. I walked through the front door and let Blaze take over. He took over and, shifted into his form, bolted out toward the forest as soon as his paws. Neither of us spoke as he ran. We needed this. We needed to clear our heads. Chapter 89. Lena. I could feel his emotions, knowing I hurt his feelings, but my head was spinning. I not only hurt him, but Eli was also angry too. I needed to process everything. Bex was angry with me, and I knew why. My head spun out of control, and how my father spoke about the Luna ceremony made her see red. You are so selfish, yelled Bex in my head, which made me look back at her. You hurt mate, he wants, I cut her off with a growl. I want a Luna ceremony, I said. I just need to think. Bex stared back at me, taken aback by what I had just said. What is there to think about? She asked as she stared at me. I sighed as I walked over to my bed and sat down. It's the traditions that got to me, I said as I looked back at her. Bex frowned, but I shook my head. I'm all for the dress and ceremony part, but I want to do something else, nothing like any other packs would expect. Bex moved her head to the side. Why not tell mate that? She asked. I sighed. I wanted to, I said. But Dad opened his mouth, and I let my anger get the better of me. Bex stared back and sighed but didn't say anything. Can you tell Blaze I'm sorry? I asked, which made her look at me. Bex sighed. I blocked him, she whispered. I wanted to know what you were thinking, I didn't want to give him any hope unless I knew where your head was. I sighed. I know I f'd up, but part of me knew I had to find out something. I looked toward where my phone was and picked it up. I needed some advice, but who? What about Alpha Frank? Bex said. You can tell him what you want and see if it is possible. That would work, I thought. I placed my phone on the bed and walked to the door to listen. There was nothing, not even a sound. Seems everyone has left, muttered Bex. I stepped back and decided to get ready. I needed to look the part of a Luna. I quickly placed a dress over my head and straightened it out. I stepped into my flats and made sure I looked okay. I was going to be seeing Alpha Frank. Once I was ready, I opened my door, tiptoed out, and headed down the stairs. I glanced around and heard movement in the kitchen. I knew it was my father and uncle, so I went to the front door and closed it behind me. I walked away from the house and headed toward the pack house. Bex was close. I walked up till I got to the pack house and headed to the office where I knew Alpha Frank would be. I walked straight to the office and knocked. Come in, shouted Alpha Frank. I opened the door and walked in. Alpha Frank sat behind the desk and looked up at me. His eyes widened, but a smile came across his face. Lena, he said as he placed his pen down and looked at me. I thought you would be with Eli. I didn't say anything, only walked further into the office. I took a seat in front of him. As I looked at him, his eyes were full of concern. Please don't tell Eli or my father I'm here, I said. I disagreed with them. Well, more as they spoke, and I didn't say anything. Alpha Frank looked at me and nodded. Bex was close but not on show. Talk to him, she whispered. I sighed. Eli and I mated last night, I said. I also marked Eli, but he didn't mark me. He told me that he would wait till I was ready. Alpha Frank looked at me, and he grinned. That's amazing news, he said, but I could feel his eyes bore into mine, which made him frown. What happened? He asked. What did he say this time? I looked at him and shook my head. Actually, he didn't say anything, I said. It was my father. Alpha Frank looked at me, confused. My father and uncle came to the house and noticed the mark on Eli's neck, and my father started to talk about the Luna ceremony and that. Alpha Frank stared at me but didn't say anything. I got uptight about it, as I wanted to know what traditions we would have to follow, I said. Let me guess, it scared you, he said. His eyes stared at me, but his face softened when I stared back and nodded. I acted like a childish and left the table, I said as a lone tear escaped my eyes. Eli was hurt by how I acted, and when I didn't want him to come in to talk to me, he got angry and left. Alpha Frank nodded. There was silence in the room, but I gathered my courage and spoke again. I do want a Luna ceremony, I blurred out and looked at him, his eyebrows up at me. I just want to change it. I don't want to be traditional, and you know I'm not. Alpha Frank smiled. I know, he said. What do you have in mind? I stared at him. I want the dress and the ceremony, I said. But instead of having dancing and music, I want to hold something else. Alpha Frank looked intrigued. Like what exactly? He asked. Here goes, I thought. I want to hold an ultimate fight challenge here, I said. Alpha Frank's eyes widened. I know it's traditional for all Alphas and Lunas to turn up to celebrate the new Alpha and Luna taking over and being together as mates, but, I said, as I kept my eyes on him. I want to fight and have Eli by my side. I want every Alpha to know that we are united and nothing can stop us. It will also show what I'm like as a fighter, but also I want to send a message to every Alpha out there that we are not to be messed with. I don't want anyone else to suffer as we did at the hands of Alpha Trevor and not by any other Alpha. Alpha Frank stared at me but didn't speak for a moment. Bex stared at him and smiled. Alpha Frank smirked. I take it you didn't want to run this past Eli first, he said as a grin appeared. I shook my head. I wanted to make sure it was possible to do it, I said. I will get a dress and do everything I need to for the ceremony, but the fight will happen straight after. Alpha Frank smiled. I think it's a fantastic idea, he said. I believe it will show everyone what kind of Luna you are, but I am going to invite more than Alphas and Lunas to the ceremony, now we are doing this. I stared at him, feeling slightly confused. Alpha Frank laughed. I'm going to ask all the elders to attend, he said, which made me widen my eyes. Elder Isaac made an assumption that made me want to pee his heart out, and it was aimed at you. I stared at him as he sighed. He told me that this whole mess was over a Luna that was never Luna material, he said. I couldn't help the low growl escape my lips. Bex was growling loudly in my head and standing on all paws. Stupid elder, she growled. Alpha Frank smiled. I told him he would have to find out what kind of Luna you are and meet you, he said. And what better way than to showcase you in an ultimate fight? I nodded. I will arrange the fight, he said and smiled. The Luna ceremony too. All you need to do is settle on a few things, such as your dress, flowers, and probably a few more. I will have Sophia do the rest, as she and Logan are." He stopped and looked at me, giving me a knowing look. I nodded. "I think that will be a good idea," I said. "I will need all the help I can get." Alpha Frank nodded but sighed. "We just need to decide on a date," he said. I looked at him. I knew exactly when I wanted my Luna ceremony. "In a month from now," I said, which made Alpha Frank look at me with wide eyes. "A month from now to the date," I said. "It would be my mother's birthday, and what better way than to have my Luna ceremony, to celebrate me being the Pax Luna and a fight to establish me as a fighter who no one can take down." Alpha Frank nodded as his face softened. "I think that would be a brilliant idea," he said. I smiled. "She will be with me on that day and forever," I said. Alpha Frank nodded. I sighed and got up from the chair. Alpha Frank looked at me and stared. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I have a mate to find," I said with a knowing look. "I need to tell him so we can start doing everything and even train," I said. Alpha Frank nodded and smiled. "You might find him at the lake," he said. "He goes there when he needs to clear his head." I nodded and turned to walk away, but Alpha Frank stopped me as he spoke, which made me look back at him. "I will get this whole thing arranged," he said, "and Lena, I am happy to hear you have accepted my son as your mate." I smiled and nodded. I turned and walked out of the office. I knew I had to find him, and I knew where to look, thanks to Alpha Frank. "Bex," I said to her as I walked toward the front door of the pack house. I could see pack members coming closer. "Find our mate," I said to her. She didn't need to be told twice as she shifted and took over. She jumped in the air, landed with a thud, and pounded in the direction of the lake. We needed to find Eli. I needed to tell him. Bex tried to get through to Blaze, but he blocked her, which made her more pissed. Her determination set in, and she picked up speed as she ran toward the lake. "I am going to kick his ass," he muttered. I couldn't help but smirk. "You can do that once I speak to Eli," I said. Bex didn't say anything as she ran, and it wasn't long before we could smell his scent. We were here, and I needed to talk to him, whether he was ready or not. Chapter 90. Eli Blaze ran for over an hour and headed toward the lake. As he approached, he walked over to the lake and had a drink. I moved forward and looked through his eyes. He took in his surroundings once he finished drinking. Blaze grunts. "What's up?" I asked. Blaze sighs. "Bex has been trying to reach out, and I put a block on her," he muttered. I frowned. "Why would you do that?" I asked. Blaze growls. "Because she did it to me," he snarled. I stared back as his eyes met mine. "Human mate was selfish," he growled. "She should have spoken to us." I looked at Blaze in surprise. He has always been on her side about most things, but after today, something has changed. I didn't say anything. I knew I had to let Blaze calm down. As for me, I was still trying to figure out what had happened. I wasn't prepared for the talk about Luna's ceremony, especially not with her father and uncle there with us. I wanted to wait till Lena was ready. Her father was out of line in bringing it up, but I wanted to know what she thought, but instead of talking to me, she left and wouldn't even open her door to me. I sighed as Blaze lay down near the water's edge. The water settled us as we listened to the surroundings. The birds were busy in the trees, and the other animals were running around, but nothing fazed Blaze. After minutes of peace, we heard a branch break, making Blaze look up. He didn't move as a scent wafted over to us, and we knew who it was. Lena. Blaze turned to look to see where she was, and out stepped the purest of wolves. Bex. Bex growled at him. I think you're in the doghouse, I muttered. Blaze grunted but didn't say anything. Blaze stared at Bex but didn't even pull the block down, which only worsened the situation. Blaze, I muttered as I stared through his eyes. Bex looked annoyed, but I watched as she shifted back into Lena a few seconds later. I was about to push forward, but Blaze grunted. I frowned. What? I groaned, but Blaze didn't say anything back to me. I could only stare through his eyes as I watched Lena stare back at us. Blaze, she calls out. Please, can I talk to Eli? Blaze shook his head and bared his teeth at her, letting a little snarl slip past his lips. Wolf, I said. She wants to talk. She can talk to me, he grunted. I stared. Ah, I know what this was about, he wanted an apology from her for how she acted. Lena stared at him and moved her head to the side. Like a light switching on, Lena took a step closer but stopped. I'm sorry, Blaze, she said. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was overwhelmed by everything and took it out on the wrong person and Wolf. Blaze didn't say anything. His eyes were on her, he didn't move. Lena sighed and stepped closer again as she carried on talking to Blaze. I'm truly sorry, she said as she was about an inch from us and fell to her knees in front of him. I keep a close eye on him but also watch Lena. Bex didn't mean to block you either, she said, looking up at him. She was trying to persuade me to talk to you, and I am stubborn, so I didn't listen to her. I hurt her too, as well as you and Eli. Lena stared into his eyes and smiled. She reached out and touched his fur, slowly moving her hand up, which grazed over his fur, went behind his ear, and tickled. Blaze groaned and nuzzled his head into her lap as she kept the movements. Big softy, I muttered. Blaze looked back at me with his tongue sticking out. Mate, he muttered. I smiled. Do you forgive me? Lena asked as she kept tickling behind his ear, which was his favorite spot. Blaze moved closer to her and licked the side of her face. Thank you, she said. Can I talk to Eli? I need to explain to him too. Blaze let out a grunt and stood up, which made Lena's hand fall into her lap. Blaze overshadowed Lena as he covered her whole body when he stood. Lena watched with a smile as Blaze stepped back and pushed me forward, letting me shift back into my human form. Lena stared at me, and I could tell she was trying to be serious and trying not to look at me. I stood before her but didn't move. My eyes traced over her face as she stared back. Lena moved and stood up in front of me. I want a Luna ceremony, she said, making my eyes go wide. She said but stopped. She let out a sigh. I don't do well under pressure, she said. I wasn't expecting my father and uncle to show up and then to mention Luna's ceremony too, it was all too much. I didn't say anything. Lena stepped closer and placed her hand into mine, which sent tingles through every part of my body. I'm sorry for not talking to you, she said. I need to learn to open up to you and talk more openly about how I feel. I nodded. Lena stared at me and moved her head to the side. Will you forgive me? She asked. I stared at her but sighed. Lena, I said as I gripped her hand tight and pulled her toward me, slamming her into my chest. Her eyes widened as she looked at me, as I placed my hands on her waist. Talk to me, tell me what you're thinking, I said. I want you to feel like you can tell me anything. I know I can be an A*S sometimes, but I will take everything on board. All I want is for you to talk to me. I stared down at her. Her eyes roamed over my face till they settled on mine. I want a Luna ceremony, she blurts out. I want the whole ceremony as normal as possible but with a twist. I moved my eyebrows up at her. Lena sighed. All the alphas and Lunas will be there, right? She said, and all I could do was nod, trying to think where this was going. Lena lets out a breath. I want to hold an ultimate fight after our ceremony, she states as she looks at me. My mouth dropped open. She wants an ultimate fight at her Luna ceremony. I don't know whether I should be turned on or concerned. But something hit me. You want to fight, I said. Lena nodded. Blaze growled. Over my dead body, he muttered. I stared at her and frowned. Why? I asked. Lena stepped back and dropped her hands to her side. Her eyes were on me. You know the whole dumbass thing comes into play when you don't listen, she muttered. I want to fight, but I want you by my side. I stared at her. Blaze was forward, but he kept calm. What changed his tune all of a sudden? I thought. I want to fight, she said. I want all the alphas and lunas to know that we are not a pack they can attack because we are weak. I want to show them I am one Luna they can never take down. Well, more like proof that I'm no pushover. I can't help but feel slightly proud and worried at the same time. Lena stepped closer and closed the gap between us. Stand with me by the ring, she said. Be my mate, Alpha, and more, believe I can do this. I stared at her, and determination was written all over her face. Mate has a point, muttered Blaze. After everything we have been through due to that Alpha, he tormented every one of his pack members, stalked our mate, and even tried to hurt her. I looked back at Blaze. His eyes were full of admiration for Lena. She wants us to be there with her, he said. She wants us to be her mate and support her. I want to be that, and that's all we ever wanted. I knew he was right, honestly, I was proud of her. I looked back and noticed Lena was walking away. I really got to stop talking to Blaze. I used my speed and ran up to her, turning her around, which made her eyes pop. I picked her up off the ground as she squealed, her legs instantly wrapped around my waist, and her arms went around my neck. Lena stares down at me. What? She yelled. I placed my hand on the nape of her neck and pulled her toward me. I moved my lips to hers and kissed her hard as her lips touched mine. Lena kissed me back. There was no fight in her. I slide my tongue over her bottom lip, and she opens, giving me access as I slip my tongue in and roam around her mouth. I kissed her long and hard, but Lena pulls back slightly, panting for breath. What was that for? She rasped. I smirked as I leaned my head on hers. Mine, I murmured. Lena moved back and stared at me. You agree to, she went to say, but I nodded, cutting her off. I want you to do it, I said. Our pack has been through enough, and we have to consider the pack members that have moved here from Alpha Trevor's pack. They need closure, and giving them this fight will prove that to them, but mainly for all the packs around, it will prove that you and I are not to be messed with, especially when they have a Luna that can kick some serious ass. Lena smiled. I stared at her and kissed her lips again. Lena kissed me back, but a moan slipped through, she murmured as she looked at me. How is it possible to want you so much? I laughed. I walked with her legs still wrapped around me and came to a nearby tree. I leaned her against the tree and pulled back slightly. Now, I murmured as I leaned into the crook of her neck. How will you make it up to me for being a brat? I kissed her neck and worked my way up, but stopped and went back down. I'm not a brat, she rasped, but it came out like a moan. I smirked against her neck as I licked her neck till I got to her earlobe and sucked. She whispered. Blaze was howling in my head. Made her now, he groaned. Bex says she wants you, now. I could tell she wanted me, and I didn't need Blaze telling me either. Her arousal hit my nose as I groaned. Lena, I grunted. Are you wet for me? I pulled back and stared at her, her eyes were holding so much, but she didn't say anything, only nodded. How wet? I asked as I moved my hand to her waist. I know I can't let her come. I slowly pulled my fingers out. I looked at Lena, panting hard, but confusion was written all over her face. Why did you stop? She gasped. Oh no, you don't, she whispered as a smirk itched the corner of her mouth. My turn. I look at her as she unravels her legs from around my waist in one fast movement and uses her back to push slightly off the tree. I stood in front of her as she stood before me. It is only fitting that I make you come, and I suffer for the rest of the day, she mutters as she drops to her knees in front of me. Eli, she groans. I look at her, but all I want is her. Something feels weird, it feels like something has taken over my body. I stared at her but unraveled her from me, ensuring she was facing me. Turn around and bend over, I say as I kiss her lips. After the brief kiss, Lena moves, does as she is told, and turns around. On all fours, I say as I lean close to her ear. I remember I liked her like this last night and how much she moaned. I knew pack members would hear her or even see us, but nothing was going to stop me. Lena went on her knees and placed her hands on the ground. Lena. Eli, she screamed. I know I'm hitting her as she gets louder, moaning my name. Anyone who sees us like this will get an eye full of what was happening, but I didn't care. Lena was mine and only mine. Eli, she moans. Just like that. Mark me. I growl. You sure? I muttered. Please, she begged. I want you to mark me. Now. Eli, she says, sleepy. Mine. I looked down at her with a smile as Lena moved around and sat in a sitting position on me, making sure her legs were together. She rests her hand on my shoulder as her eyes close. I feel all her weight on me, but something hard crashes into me more, all her emotions come flooding and send me into a wave as I feel her warmth spread around me. I know I should take her home, but I want her in my arms and nothing else. Blaze was bouncing around in my head, but I ignored him. I held Lena tight as she slept against me, but realization kicked in. I finally marked my mate. Chapter 91. Lena. The warmth around me keeps me safe, and I don't want to move, but I slowly open my eyes and try to adjust to my surroundings. My head was full of people talking, but I shut it out. I moved slightly, but I was held tight against something hard. Don't move, Eli whispers. It's so nice sitting like this. I couldn't help but lean into him more, but I knew we had to move. I moved slightly, but Eli's arms around me tightened. I looked at him, and his eyes met mine. We need to move, I whispered. Eli leaned toward me and placed a tender kiss on my lips. He rested his head on mine and sighed. I closed my eyes as I took in his scent. My mind raced as the events in the forest came back to me, and I couldn't help the embarrassment of knowing everyone in the pack could hear us. Not only that, I allowed Eli to mark me. His emotions were triggering Bex and me, we were going with what he was feeling and wanting at the time, and that was us. I moved my arm and placed it to my marking spot and gently ran over the mark. Warmth spread through me, but Eli tightened his grip. I opened my eyes and pulled back slightly. Eli rests his head against the tree and stares back at me with a smile. I stared at him, but his emotions came flooding in, concern and worry. I moved my hand and placed it on his cheek. "I don't regret you marking me," I whispered. Relief flooded through me. I smiled. "I don't know what came over me," I said. "1 minute, I wanted to make it up to you, the next, all I could think about was you marking me." Eli nodded but looked sheepish. "That might have been my fault," he said as he placed his hand on mine to stop my hand from moving on his cheek. "I wanted you so much, but everything inside me intensified, and all I could think about was having you. I didn't mean to pressure you into having my mark." The concern came flooding back, but I shook my head. "You didn't pressure me," I murmured. "Bex and I wanted you to. Bex must have willed it more as I lost grip, and the mate bond has been affecting me more than normal over the last few days." Eli stared at me but smiled. "I'm happy you let me mark you," he said, but a frown appeared. "Even though your emotions are like a roller coaster." I smirked. "Welcome to the world of a woman," I said. Eli laughed. We stayed still for a moment, but I looked around. No one was around, which was a good thing. "I think we should move," I murmured. I could feel Beck's move in my head, which gave me an idea. "Why don't we let Blaze and Bex run for a bit?" I asked. "They can have some fun, and we can head back to the pack house to see everyone." Eli nodded. "Blaze likes the sound of that," he said and stared blankly for a few moments, but when he returned, he groaned. I moved my eyebrow at him. "You don't want to know," he said. "I suggest not to look through Bex's eyes for the next hour." I stared at him blankly, but Bex pushed forward. "Blaze wants to mate," she said with a sheepish look. My eyes widened. "Yeah, I will not be looking through her eyes until she pushes me forward. I don't want to watch that." I could hear chuckling in my head, which I ignored. I moved and got up from Eli, holding my hand out to him to take. He took it and got up with no help from me. He looked at me and smiled. He leaned into me and placed a kiss on my neck. "See you in a little while," he whispered. Eli took a step back and shifted into Blaze. I watched as the big black wolf stared back at me. I smiled. I walked over and placed my hand on his head, which he nudged. "Blaze," I said. "Little mate," rang out in my head, taking me by surprise. My eyes rounded as I stared into his eyes. "Thank you, little mate, for letting us mark you," he said. "I can now talk to you as well as Bex." I smiled. "I wanted to make it up to you and Eli, even though marking wasn't what I intended, but I am happy you did it," I said. Blaze nodded and moved to stand, his head reaching over me. He leaned down and licked my cheek, sending tingles through me. "Now," he said, stepping back and looking down at me. "Let my horny mate out, so I can have her." I blushed. I looked back at Bex, who was now staring back at me. "Have fun," I said as I let her take over and shift into her proper form. "Oh, I plan to," she said as she shook out her fur. Once she stopped, I was settled in the back of her head and was about to move back further, so I could give her some privacy when she called out. "Lena, I love you," she said. I stopped and looked at her, warmth spreading through me. I didn't say anything but smiled back. She carried on talking to me. "I know you haven't had it easy," she said. "But I am so proud of you, and thank you for letting us have our mate." I nodded but didn't need to say anything to her. I moved into her head and placed a block up, as Bex and Blaze ran off into the forest. An hour and a half had passed, and I felt something tugging on the block I placed up. I had fallen asleep. I was settled and at peace. I needed it. I removed the block and was instantly moved forward. I shifted back into my human form and looked in front of me as I lost my balance. I started to fall forward, but big arms grabbed me, pulling me back into a hard chest. I looked up and Eli stared down with a grin. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Well, I blocked Bex while they went for a run," I said as I leaned in more. "I didn't want to see what Blaze did to her." "I can show if you want," Bex yells in my head, sounding slightly amused. I could hear a chuckle, indicating that Blaze was listening in on us. "No thanks," I muttered. I looked at Eli, who smirked. "Don't look like that," I said. "It's going to take some getting used to having them both in my head." Eli laughed. "I know what you mean," he said. "I had less than 24 hours on you and still haven't." Eli looked at me and leaned toward me. He placed a kiss on my lips and moved back. "Everyone is waiting for us in the office," he said as he looked up. Only then did I realize that we were standing outside the pack house. I knew we were still ND, but that never bothered any of the pack members, as many were always ND due to shifting into their wolves and back again. Eli places his hand in mine and guides me toward the pack house door, where an Omega was waiting for us. She held out some clothes for us and smiled. "Alpha," she said as she handed Eli a t-shirt and shorts, to which he nodded. The Omega looked at me and gave me an even bigger smile. "Luna," she said, handing me a t-shirt dress. "I am so honored to meet you," she said. I smiled. "Thank you," I said. The Omega bowed but looked up at me for a moment before she placed her hand on my arm. "I'm sorry for what happened to you all those years ago," she said, looking between Eli and me. I would have tried to help, but no one would have believed an Omega or even taken what I said seriously. I stared at her, not knowing what to say, but I did feel for her. Omegas are overlooked because they are meant to be weak. "It's okay," I said. "I would have felt the same way if I were in your position. But from now on, if anything like that ever happens again, which it won't, but still, or you need to talk, you come to me, my door is always open for you, and all." The Omega stared at me in shock but shook her head and recovered. She smiled and nodded. "Thank you, Luna," she said. "I will keep that in mind." The Omega turned and walked away, but I couldn't help but watch her leave, but also wondering how many other pack members felt like that. Eli placed his hand in mine, which made me look at him as we turned to walk away. We headed to the office, but I felt pride coming from him through the mate bond. "You are already making yourself an amazing Luna," he said as we approached the office. "I'm happy you are taking the role in your stride." I looked at him and smiled. "I guess I want all pack members to feel like they can come to me about anything, whether small or big," I said. "I know if your mum were still alive, I would have gone to her more than anything with what was going on." I felt a hint of pain through the bond, but I squeezed his hand. "Eli, your mum would be so proud of the man you are now, the alpha you are truly becoming," I said and went onto my tippy toes and placed a kiss on his cheek. "Come on," I said. "Let's see what's going on now." Eli smiled as he opened the door to the office, letting me walk in first. Chapter 92. Eli. I followed Lena into the office, feeling slightly better about what she said. I missed my mum, but not always does someone tell me something like that. I closed the door behind me and faced everyone. My father stood up with Tim, Keith, Logan, and Sophia, all spaced around the office, all grinning. "Congratulations, Sophia said as she walked up to Lena, pulling her into a hug. We finally have our Alpha and Luna. I smiled. Everyone hugged and congratulated us more, and once they were all out of the way, we all sat down around the office. So what's happening about the Luna ceremony? Asked Tim. When is it happening? I glanced at Lena, who had a slight frown. Blaze moved in my head. Little mate not happy with Father Wolf, Blaze said. I sighed. I knew I had to let Lena deal with this, it was her father, after all. Dad, Lena said. I wish you would not keep on about the Luna ceremony. I can tell you when Eli and I are ready. I smiled, knowing that we were planning it sooner. I watched as Lena looked around toward my father, who nodded at her. Lena smiled and looked at everyone. I knew my father was making sure it was okay to do the ultimate fight, and judging by his face, he had the go-ahead to arrange it. Most ceremonies had to go through the elders, and the Luna ceremony was one of them. I glanced at Lena, who was ready to tell everyone what she wanted, and I couldn't be prouder of her. I am having a Luna ceremony, she said. But it will be slightly different. What do you mean? Asked Tim, looking confused. I looked between Logan, Keith, and Sophia, who were wearing the same facial expressions. Well, I knew I had to have a Luna ceremony, she said and looked at me. I smiled to let her know she should tell them. I knew she could feel everything I was feeling from the mate bond. Lena sighed. I want to hold an Ultimate Fighter event, she said. Everyone's eyes went wide, all except mine and my father's. You can't do that, her father said. We have traditions, rules in place. No one will want to see you fight, not in a dress. I could feel Blaze stand up in my head and growl. I frowned at him as his eyes met mine. You are agreeing to this, he muttered. I am, I said. I want Lena to have whatever she wants, even if it means she wants to fight. Lena gave me a small smile as I glanced over at her. Thank you, she said through a mind link. Lena turned her attention to her father and glared at him. Dad, this is my ceremony, she said. I don't follow traditions. I will still have the dress, ceremony, and even food afterward. The fight will take place after the ceremony. I want all pack members there to see me. I don't see the point, muttered Tim. I growled. Well, there will be a point, I glared at him. The fight is a good idea, not only will pack members be able to witness their Luna fight, but the other alphas will also be present. The fight will show what kind of Luna Lena is and how strong she truly is. Elders will be there too, my father called out. I moved my eyebrows at him. My father moved toward Lena and smiled but looked at Tim. Tim, he said, Lena is an amazing fighter, and you even witnessed it yourself when you were at Alpha Gareth's for the charity event. Tim stared at my father but sighed. You're right, he said and looked toward Lena. I'm sorry, sweetheart, he said and walked over to her and hugged her. Lena hugged him back but pulled back slightly and looked at him. Dad, I want the Luna ceremony, she said, smiling. But I also want alphas and elders around to know that this pack is protected and we will never back down from a fight. Tim smiled. Well, I know full well when they watch her fight, he said with some slight humor in his voice, no one will come near you. I chuckled. Lena smiled but looked over at me. I also want to say that it will be my final fight as an ultimate fighter, she said. I stared at her, and my eyes widened. What do you mean? I asked. You don't have to give up anything. Lena looked at me and stepped closer, placing her hand in mine while her eyes bore into mine. Don't you think I will have more to focus on here in the pack, she said. I mean, I will be your Luna. I want to improve some training and even help some of them get better. Blaze howls in excitement in my head. He is one happy wolf to hear that. So was I, too. I was over the moon by her words. She was accepting her role as my Luna. I pull Lena toward me, making her hit my chest and placing my mouth on hers, not caring about everyone in the office. I kiss her hard on the lips. I pulled back and stared at Lena as a slight blush spread across her cheeks. Do you know how that makes me feel? I asked. But I stopped myself. I was about to tell Lena I love her. Lena stared at me with wide eyes, but someone cleared their throats. I looked over to see 5 smirks appearing back at me. Keith gave me a knowing look but looked toward Lena. So, when is your big day, Luna? He asked. I stared at him, but I could feel Lena's eyes on me. My Luna ceremony will be a month away, on the 20th, she said. I quickly looked back at her. The 20th? That date sounded familiar to me, but why? 20th. Tim breathes out. Lena looked over at him and smiled. Yes, the 20th, she said. I glanced at Logan, who had a blank expression. That's Mum's birthday, he muttered. I looked back at Lena, who closed her eyes to calm herself. I know, she said. I wanted to do something on that day, some hope she's with me in spirit. I placed my hand on Lena's waist and held her close. She opened her eyes and looked up at me with a smile. After a few moments of quiet, Lena looked away from me and stared at Keith. Uncle Keith, she spoke. Can you train me? I want a full training schedule. I looked over to Keith, who smiled and nodded. Too right, he said. I will devise a plan and develop some new techniques you can try. We can start in a few days. Lena nodded but turned to face Sophia. Sophia, I need you to help me with the Luna ceremony, she said. I will have to have you organize everything though, due to the training I have to do, but maybe we can arrange a time and place to go over things. Sophia beamed. I would love to help you, she said. I will come by tomorrow midday, and we can go over every detail, and when we are done, I can get started. I smiled. What about the rest of us? Asked Logan. What do we do? I looked over at Logan and smiled. You and I are going to be doing pack work, I said and looked over to my father and Tim. While Keith is training Lena, Dad and Tim will be concentrating on organizing the ultimate fight event. We will help with some things, but we need to run the everyday things of the pack. Logan nodded. I looked around. Do we all know what we are doing now? I asked. Everyone nodded. I think we all should get to it, I said. I looked over to Lena, who was staring at me. I opened a mind link to her. Can we spend a few hours together? I asked. Sure, she said. I will make some food for us, and we can have an evening until we have to start it all again. I closed the mind link down, moved my head down to her head, and placed a kiss. Lena and I said our goodbyes and left the office. Blaze was relaxed in my head, and I could feel him hum. I felt content as Lena, and I walked back through the pack house together. We passed some pack members who bowed to us. I was happy. We walked out of the pack house and headed to our home. Chapter 93. Lena. I woke up early the next day after spending the evening and night with Eli. It was nice to relax and have him to myself. We talked about the Luna ceremony and the ultimate fight challenge. I looked over to where Eli was, and his soft snores flooded my hearing. I couldn't help but look at him. I removed his arm from my waist and placed it on his stomach. I moved quietly and quickly got dressed into some gym stuff. I wanted to go for a run. I knew training would happen soon, and running helped me warm up. You never know with Uncle Keith, he may say a few days, but he could actually mean today. He was annoying like that. I placed my trainers on and looked over to Eli to make sure he was asleep, which he was. I know he wants to help me train, but I think he will be a distraction, a good one, but also one that will keep me from training. I got up from the bed and walked out of the room. Bex was flat out in my head, which was a good thing as she would have wanted me to wake up Eli for him to join us. I needed to run on my own, it was the only time where I could keep my mind focused on what was happening on hand. I walked down the stairs and headed out the front door. I placed my ear pods in and ran. I ran for miles. I kept my mind clear, ignoring any mind links and whatever was going on. I needed to keep it together. After an hour, I ran back home and headed inside. I took my ear pods out and listened. I could hear Eli's soft snores. I looked back into my head, and Bex was still out cold. I smiled. I might as well make food for Eli and me. I walked into the kitchen and started to cook. It wasn't too long after I cooked the sausages that I heard movement upstairs and I knew Eli was awake. I knew today I was spending it with Sophia, we were going over ideas for the Luna ceremony. I knew she was the right person for the job. I knew I needed help, training was going to be my main focus. I heard Eli's coming down the stairs as I was dishing up the food. I turned around as he walked into the kitchen. I smiled, as I held 2 plates and placed them on the table. "Food's done," I said as I pulled my chair out and sat. "Where were you?" he asked as he sat next to me and started to place food on his fork. "Blaze sensed you were gone, but didn't know where." I ate what was in my mouth and looked up at him. "I went for a run this morning," I said. "I needed to clear my head. I will be doing this every morning as it's my way of warming before I start training." Eli nodded. "You could have woken me," he said. "I would have joined you." I smiled. "I know," I said. "The thing is I needed to clear my head, I feel overwhelmed." Eli stared at me, but movement in my head got my attention. I looked back at Bex, and she moved her head to the side. "Mate can help us," she said. "We can use his help." I stared at her, but I didn't say anything. "Lena," called Eli, bringing me back to look at him. I stared at him. His eyebrows were raised. "Bex," he said, and I just nodded. I needed to change this subject. "So, what are you going to do today?" I asked. "Sophia is coming here soon to help me come up with stuff for the Luna ceremony." Eli stared at me, but stared with a blank expression. Someone was clearly mind-linking him. When he got back to me, he frowned. "Well, I was going to ask if I could help you train today, help you get started," he said. "But Logan mind-linked me and mentioned I have a ton of paperwork to get through and also Keith wants to talk to me." I stared at him, arching my eyebrows slightly. "Why would my uncle want to see you?" I asked. Eli shrugged. "I have no clue," he said. I felt a sense something was up, but knowing my uncle, it was most probably to do with my training. Eli and I ate everything I had done. Eli picked up all the dishes and placed them in the sink. I couldn't help but watch what he was doing. He turned to me and smiled. "I will do these," he said. "Go and have a shower before Sophia comes, I will join." He started to say something, but a mind link came through, it was Sophia. "Hey Lena," she said. "I am on my way to yours now." Okay, I said and closed the mind link down, and stared back at Eli, who was now frowning. I hear Beck's grunt in my head, but I ignore her. I guess she wanted the shower with mate. I did, she muttered as she turned in my head. I was going to mention I would join you in the shower, but I guess Sophia is on her way, he said, pulling me from my thoughts. Yeah, I said and moved toward him. I leaned up onto my tippy toes and placed a kiss on his cheek. I pulled back as Eli placed his hands on my waist and looked down at me. I will have the shower on my own, I said. Maybe we can have one later when you finish in the office. Eli smiled and leaned down to capture my lips, placing a tender kiss in its place. He moves back and his hands fall to his side. I best be off, he said. I nodded as I watched as Eli moved away from me and headed toward the living area. I followed him, but he was about to walk toward the stairs to go up when someone knocked on the door. Eli looked at me and headed toward the door and opened the door. There stood Sophia. Morning, Alpha, she said and looked toward Eli. Her eyes landed on me and her grin widened. Luna, she said as she stepped inside the house. Eli nodded and looked over at me. I will be going to the pack house, he said. I can grab a shower there. I will see you later. I nodded and smiled. Well, it looks like I will have to shower later after all. Eli left, leaving Sophia looking at me. Shall we get started? She asked. We have loads to plan. I even got a notebook to put everything in. I smiled. Come on, I said, turning back around and heading into the kitchen. I will put the kettle on, I said. I think we will need all the coffee we can get. Sophia giggled as she followed me. I could feel Beck's move around in my head, but I knew she was settling in for the next few hours as it was going to be long. We had to plan everything and I had to leave Sophia plan it all. This was the only time we could do this and all before I started training. I flipped the kettle on and heard the chair scrap behind me. I knew Sophia was getting comfortable to start. After a few moments, 2 mugs of coffee were ready and I placed them down in front of us. Sophia had a pen in her hand and a notebook opened up. Shall we begin? She said. I nodded and started to tell her everything I wanted. 3 hours, 4 mugs of coffee later, Sophia and I had a list of everything I wanted for my Luna's ceremony, from the flowers to the suits I wanted Eli to wear. We had it all planned. We chose the pack house for the ceremony, as Sophia told me that Alpha Frank had a place to hold the ultimate fight, which I learned was outside. The only thing on the agenda was my dress. I knew what I wanted, and it wasn't in any stores. Finally, the dress, she asked as her eyes met mine for the millionth time. What are you looking for? I stared at her for a few moments but sighed. Actually, I said. Can I show you something? Sophia looked at me with a confused look. We both moved from the table and walked toward the stairs. I didn't want to tell her, I wanted to show her instead. We walked past all the bedrooms and stood below the attic hatch. I grabbed the hook and hooked the latch handle, and pulled it toward me. Stairs came down and I walked up. Sophia was right behind me and as we both stood in the attic, I took in everything. My dad never threw any of my things, especially her clothes. I walked over to a wardrobe in the back and pulled it open. I knew which dress I was looking for as I remember my mother wearing it one evening for a day. It was white and laced, it went to the tops of her knees, which I wore. It might mean it would be longer, but I didn't care. Sophia stood behind me, I could feel her eyes on me. This is all your mother's stuff, she said. I nodded. Yeah, I muttered. My dad could never part with any of it. I think he might have forgotten all about this stuff too now, might since it was a few years ago, but I remember him putting everything up here one evening when he was done crying. I schemed over the dresses and spotted it. Here it is, I said and pulled out the dress. The dress had a plastic cover over it, so it looked new inside. I held it up and looked back at Sophia, who smiled. It's gorgeous, she said and sighed. What do you want to do with it? That was a question. What did I want to do with it? I shrugged. I want to use this dress and wear it, I said. I will give you permission to make it more updated. Do you know anyone who can alter it for us in time for the Luna ceremony? Sophia stared at me, blankly for a moment and nodded. I know someone, she said. We can come up with something in the next few days, only she might have to come to measure you and design something, but I am sure you won't mind doing that. I smiled. That'd be fine, I said. Uncle Keith and Eli won't mind. Sophia smiled. I turned back to the wardrobe and closed it. I handed the dress to Sophia, and we both walked down. I made sure everything was as I found it, as I didn't want Eli to nose up there. We walked down the stairs. Sophia hung the dress from the hanger on the banister and stared at it. I have to say, she said as she looked at me. There is something about his dress that screams Luna material. I smiled. Her eyes lingered on the dress more and looked back at me with a weird expression on her face. Lena, she said. I have an idea. I can design the dress to suit you and even have the person I know draw it for you to see. You can let me know what you think, if not, we can think of another way. I smiled at Sophia. I like that idea, I said. I trust you, Sophia, just get the design down and we can go from there. Sophia nodded, as a beaming smile slid across my face. We went back into the kitchen and sat down. We talked for a bit about a few other things, but Sophia stood up and made some tea. Coffee was getting to us now, we needed something else to drink. I watched as my brother's maid made the tea, but I wanted to know. How are things with you and Logan? I asked, which made her stop what she was doing and turned around to face me. You know, she asked. I nodded. Sophia leaned back against the counter and sighed. We are getting there slowly, she said and looked at me. It all came to a head when I went to find out more information from Amber, but everything was worse. She tormented me, not the other way around. She told me all the things that her and the other girls did with him. I stared at her, she clearly wanted to vent and I was going to let her. I have been in them situations many times and they aren't nice. I knew I shouldn't have let her get into my head, she said. I tortured her but I couldn't get anything else out of her. I nodded. Something comes to me and I feel movement in my head, which was Beck's. I knew she had been sleeping for a while, but I knew she was now listening into the conversation. What happened to Amber after the rogue attack? I asked. I haven't seen her around. Sophia stared at me and sighed. It seems someone got into the cells and killed her, she said. The guards were dead outside, some rogues probably went into the cells and tried to take her. I stared at her but nodded. She was torn apart, she said as our eyes met. Someone didn't want her around. I cleared my throat. You know, I said, trying to put my Luna position into good use. Having my brother on *X-ban is something, but have you tried talking to him since? I mean, he is your mate and he needs to learn to respect you. Sophia stared at me, but I carried on talking to her. The past should stay in the past, I said. I know I am a fine one to talk, but what with everything that has happened, us women are completely badass when it comes to making men pay. I noticed a hint of a smirk, itching Sophia's lips. Soph, I said, as I leaned toward her, placing my arms on the table. I am not saying to forget what happened, but at least forgive Logan. I mean, there is one thing about being mates, there is always ways to make it up to one another. I smiled. Sophia couldn't help but laugh. I assume you did that with Eli, she said as I leaned back into my chair. I moved my head to the side and looked at her. You're talking about Eli, I said. There will always be something I won't agree when it comes out of his mouth on times, but I do like the fact we can make up afterward. Sophia gave me a knowing look and turned back around to carry on with the tea. A mind link was trying to open up and it was from Eli. Hey, he murmured. How's it going? It's getting late. Hey you, I said. We all planned and she knows what I want, we might have to meet up for one or two things, but it won't take too long. I heard him sigh. That's good, he said. It seems like I have to stay here for the night. Dad needs my help with one or two things, never have an old man do a leaflet. I gave a slight laugh. Not funny, he muttered. He doesn't know what to do and Logan is training for a while. It's okay, I said. I will ask Sophia to stay, we could have a girls' night or something. Sounds like an idea, he said. I miss you. I felt tingles though the mate bond as the words. I miss you too, I said. I will mind link you later. Okay, he said and closed the link. I looked at Sophia, who was now sitting in front of me. I smiled. It seems Eli is sleeping at the pack house tonight, I said. Do you fancy a girls' night in? Sophia beamed. Yeah, she said. I would love to. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description, rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.